It was a quiet morning in the sprawling mansion of the wealthy Harrington family, where appearances were everything. Among the perfectly polished floors and gleaming chandeliers, Mrs. Grace, the family's black maid, went about her work with quiet dignity, always staying in the background as expected. But everything changed when young Ethan Harrington, the spoiled and entitled teenager of the household, stormed into the kitchen, accusing her of stealing his prized designer watch. His voice echoed through the house, dripping with arrogance and suspicion, as the staff and family looked on in shock. Mrs. Grace denied the accusation calmly, but Ethan's words stung deeper than she let on. What followed was a chain of events that would unravel shocking truths about the Harrington family and Ethan himself. Little did he know, this confrontation would lead to a life-changing lesson he'd never forget. What happens next will leave you speechless. As the days passed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had grown up in a world where his every whim was catered to, where his wealth and status seemed to shield him from the consequences of his actions. His accusation hung over the house like a storm cloud, and while Mrs. Grace continued to do her work quietly, the tension between them only grew. The other staff members had seen how Ethan often looked down on the people who served them, treating them as nothing more than background figures in his perfect world, but none had the courage to speak out. What no one knew, however, was that Ethan's watch had disappeared in the most unusual way. It wasn't where he'd last left it, but no one could have predicted how it would turn up, and who would ultimately be responsible for exposing the truth. Ethan's pride blinded him, but the truth was about to come crashing down. Ethan's mind raced as he replayed the events in his head. He couldn't fathom how his expensive watch, a gift from his father, had vanished. Mrs. Grace was the last person he'd seen in the kitchen, and it only seemed logical to accuse her. After all, she was the maid. In Ethan's world, people like her were dispensable, easily blamed for anything that went wrong. But a gnawing doubt had started to eat at him. The watch was expensive, something that meant the world to his father, and yet it had gone missing under the most peculiar circumstances. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grace remained composed, almost eerily so. She never once raised her voice or defended herself forcefully. She continued her work with quiet grace, but Ethan could sense something had changed in her eyes. He knew she was hurt, but was she hiding something more? The other servants, too, seemed on edge, as if they were watching, waiting for something to happen. None of them spoke, but the weight of their silence hung in the air. As Ethan tried to unravel the mystery, an unexpected twist began to take shape. His younger sister, Lily, had overheard a conversation between their parents that set her mind reeling. Mrs. Grace had been with the family for years, and there were things about her past no one had ever truly known. What if there was more to the story than just a stolen watch? Ethan's obsession with proving his accusation only led him further into a web of secrets, a web that was starting to entangle everyone. But none of them realized yet how deep the lies went, or how much they would change their lives. The days leading up to the weekend were filled with mounting tension. Ethan's suspicion of Mrs. Grace deepened, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he was missing something. Every time he confronted her, she would respond with a calm, almost resigned, smile, an answer that only made him feel more confused. It was as if she knew something he didn't, something he wasn't ready to understand. The more he tried to push, the more he realized that something wasn't adding up. Lily, on the other hand, had quietly become consumed by the secret conversation she overheard. She couldn't forget what she'd heard. A mention of Mrs. Grace's son, a boy who had been living in another state, far from the eyes of the Harrington family. The pieces were starting to form in her mind, but she was hesitant to reveal anything. What if she was wrong? What if it was too dangerous to confront the truth? As the family gathered for dinner that Friday night, a strange heaviness settled in the room. Ethan's father, Mr. Harrington, had been unusually quiet, his eyes occasionally darting to Mrs. Grace, as if there were an unspoken understanding between them. Ethan was on edge, his mind consumed by the thought of the missing watch, his accusations lingering in the air like a ticking clock. Suddenly, As if in slow motion, the truth began to surface in the most unexpected way. Ethan overheard his father muttering something to Mrs. Grace in the hallway, something about a promise made years ago. Ethan's heart raced as the words sunk in. His father had known more than he was letting on. And just like that, it clicked. The watch, the accusations, and Mrs. Grace's stoic silence. The truth wasn't just about a missing item. It was about a long-buried secret that could shatter everything they knew. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had been blind, so wrapped up in his own arrogance that he had never considered the possibility of betrayal from within his own family. As he walked toward the hallway, his feet heavy with dread, he realized one thing: the climax was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. As Ethan stepped closer to the hallway, his heart pounded in his chest. He had to know the truth. His father's low mutterings had only deepened the mystery, and now his instincts were telling him he was on the verge of uncovering something much bigger than a simple accusation. As he rounded the corner, ready to confront his father, he stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw shocked him to his core. Mrs. Grace, her face pale and eyes wide, was sitting at the kitchen table, holding a letter. Her fingers trembled as she looked up at Mr. Harrington, who stood just a few steps away, looking unusually grim. The letter seemed to be the focal point of their tense exchange, but before Ethan could hear more, his father abruptly turned and caught sight of him. The look in Mr. Harrington's eyes was not one of guilt or anger, but of pure, unmasked fear. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Harrington's voice was cold, but there was a strange quiver in his tone, as though the ground beneath him was shifting. Ethan, his mind racing, could hardly form words. What's going on?" He finally managed. He was no longer sure who to trust. Mrs. Grace's gaze fell to the letter in her hands. For the first time she looked vulnerable, unsure of how to speak. "Ethan, I never wanted you to know any of this. It was meant to stay hidden. But your father, he's kept a promise. A promise to me and to someone else." Before Ethan could press further, his father spoke, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You need to leave this alone, Ethan. It's not what you think." Ethan's world tilted. He had been so certain of his accusations, so sure of what he thought he knew. But now, as the pieces of this puzzle started to slip further out of his reach, he realized that he was only scratching the surface of something far more dangerous. Something that could shatter everything: the trust he had in his father, the world he had been raised in, and most importantly, his belief in who he was. The letter, the promise, Mrs. Grace's silence, all of it was starting to unravel in front of him. But Ethan still couldn't see the full picture. The stakes had been raised, and with every step forward, the answers seemed to slip further away. Now, he wasn't just looking for a missing watch. He was standing on the edge of a family secret that could tear them apart. Ethan's heart was racing, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. His father's cryptic warning only deepened the mystery, but it also spurred him into action. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. "What promise?" Ethan demanded, stepping forward. "What are you hiding from me?" Mr. Harrington's face hardened, but the fear didn't leave his eyes. He looked at Mrs. Grace, then back at Ethan, as if weighing whether to finally tell the whole story. After what felt like an eternity, he let out a heavy sigh and, with a resigned look, nodded at Mrs. Grace. It was time. Mrs. Grace stood slowly, and for the first time, she spoke with a quiet strength. "Ethan, you have every right to be angry with me, but this isn't just about a missing watch. Your father and I made a deal many years ago, a promise we had to keep, for the sake of your future." Ethan's mind was racing. He could hardly grasp the implications of what she was saying. "What deal? What future?" he asked, struggling to make sense of the fragments of a story he had never been told. With a shaky breath, Mrs. Grace pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. The envelope was old, yellowed with age. He hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. The words inside shook him to his core. It was a legal document, a letter from a lawyer stating that Mrs. Grace was, in fact, his biological mother. The man he had called father for years wasn't his real father. Mrs. Grace had been forced to give him up shortly after birth due to circumstances beyond her control. The Harrington family had adopted him, but only under the condition that his true parentage remain a secret to protect their reputation and wealth. The revelation hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. Everything he had known about his life, his identity, was a lie. His real mother, the woman he had looked down on for years, had been right there all along, working in his own home. The watch, the accusation, the tension, they had all been part of a much larger truth. His anger and pride had blinded him to what really mattered. Just as he stood there, speechless, trying to process everything, there was a sudden knock at the door. It was the police. A sheriff stepped in with a somber expression. "We've been looking for you," he said, his gaze flickering between Ethan, his father, and Mrs. Grace. "There's been an investigation. We've discovered a very different version of events." Ethan's mind was spinning, but the officer's next words shocked him further. "It turns out your father is connected to an embezzlement case. We have evidence linking him to a series of financial crimes, including illegal dealings with the very people you've been hiding from." The shock hit hard, as Ethan tried to absorb what was happening. His father wasn't just hiding the truth about his family, he was hiding the truth about his own criminal activities. Suddenly, the entire world seemed to implode. Ethan's life, already torn apart by the truth about his mother, was now shattered further. The man he had trusted his whole life was a fraud. Mrs. Grace, despite all the pain and betrayal, had been the one to protect him all these years, and now she was the only one standing in the way of the collapse of everything he had once believed. As the sheriff began reading his father his rights, Ethan stood frozen, watching the man he once called father be led away in handcuffs. The weight of everything, the lies, the secrets, the accusations, pressed down on him with an overwhelming force. The truth had come out, but it was more than he could have ever imagined. And then, just as the officers were about to leave, Mrs. Grace turned to Ethan one last time. "You'll never be the same after this, but you can choose who you want to be now." Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of years of hidden pain. As the door closed behind them, Ethan stood in the silence of the room, grappling with the truth and with the realization that his life was no longer his own. The choices he made from here on out would define who he became. But one thing was clear: nothing and no one would ever be the same again. Karen's face turned bright red as she glared at the growing crowd around her. The laughter echoed in her ears, fueling her anger. She couldn't believe this was happening. "This is ridiculous. I've parked here 1,000 times," she yelled, her voice shaking with frustration. The security guard, standing next to the tow truck driver, didn't budge. "Ma'am, you're blocking the entire lot. It's clear you're in the wrong here," he said, his tone calm but firm. Karen fumed, but before she could argue further, the officer appeared, his uniform crisp and his presence commanding attention. The officer raised an eyebrow as he approached, his gaze flicking to Karen's car being hoisted off the ground. "Ma'am, I had several complaints about your vehicle obstructing the lot. You're going to need to move it," he said, handing her a citation with practiced indifference. "For obstructing traffic." Karen's face went pale as the weight of the citation sank in. Her defiance faltered, and for the first time, she realized how powerless she truly was. Her attempts to argue with the officer only made her look worse. The tow truck driver, still in control of her car, began pulling away, and the audience's laughter seemed to grow louder. With a final defeated glance at her now empty parking spot, Karen slumped into her car, the heavy sound of the tow truck rumbling in her ears. What she had hoped would be a routine stop had spiraled into a public humiliation. Her once unshakable confidence crumbled, leaving her to wonder just how much more of this she could take.